this isn't going to be a kind of traditional book event. I'm just going to read a tiny, like 2 pages, and then Ash and I are just really going to chat because I think that that's much more hopefully interesting to you all. And so I'm going to start with, again, just 2 pages from Atmospheres of Violence, particularly because it's thinking about this historic moment in 1973 around the commemoration of the Stonewall uprisings, which are also, right, yesterday is the start of the Stonewall uprisings, and it goes on for either 3 or 7 days, depending on who you talk to. And so hopefully this will be somewhat useful to us to kind of start us off, but we're definitely not going to end here or stay here too long. So here we go. So this is from, again, the kind of middle of the introduction to the book. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera's chaotic splendor militantly unsettled the coercive gender normativity of both the dominant culture and the growing lesbian and gay activism of early 1970s New York City. In contrast to many others in the scene, Marsha and Sylvia were committed to surviving by any means necessary, which included sex work, hustling, and boosting. They lived in the underground of the economy and were always on the run from landlords, cops, and sometimes each other. Collectively, they founded STAR, which stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, in 1970, and then Star House, first in a trailer, then in a building on 2nd Avenue, a mutual aid survival project that attempted to steady the perpetual instability of their besieged community. As Black and brown street queens, their social worlds collided with the vengeful drive of gay respectability that rendered them and their people as parasitic impediments to the spoils of assimilation. That is to say, while their organizing labor was central to the emerging Gay Liberation Front and later Gay Activist Alliance, they were produced as resistant objects, unwilling to adhere to the lesbian and gay party line. Their struggle against the mandates of the GLF and GAA and other activists was met with the same malignant hostility that mainstream culture served them. This antagonism was dramatized at the 1973 Christopher Street Liberation Day, when Sylvia scaled the stage and took control of the microphone from Vito Russo, which ignited a hissing thunder in faint applause. In response to the crowd's disgust, she shouted, quote, "Y'all better quiet down," continuing, "I've been trying to get up here all day for your gay brothers and gay sisters in jail that write me every motherfucking week and ask for your help, and all you do is not a goddamn thing for them." Just 4 years after the Stonewall, she was already living the painful betrayal of the movement's assimilatory agenda. Sylvia's radiant solidarity with others experiencing houselessness and incarceration was meant to implode the joyful celebration, a barricade against good feelings that are assumed to be on the other side of struggle. Quote, "I've been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck is wrong with you all?" Her treatment by lesbian and gay activists was a mirror for the ways she was abused by the thrust of heteronormativity and its gender directives, which, in theory, they were all fighting to radically transform. Through exhausted rage, she concluded her manifesto with a twist of condemnation and a call to action. Quote, "The people are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to white, middle-class, white club. And that's what y'all belong to. Revolution now, gay power, louder, gay power." In response to the historic and ongoing forms of degradation, which include the booming whiteness and gender normativity of what consolidated under the sign LGBT history, Marsha and Sylvia have been revived as emblematic of a trans of color politic from Stonewall to the current moment. While important, this vital recovery performs a second order displacement by solidifying their identities, which were in practice constantly lived in beautiful inconsistency. Imposing a more current identity on a subject of history is part of the trouble, a trouble we can never avoid, as we account for specificity and also for tendencies of reoccurrence that build beyond themselves. What I hope Atmospheres of Violence preserves is the spirit of Sylvia and Marsha's commitment, conscious or not, to being against the intelligibility culled by a liberal state. In other words, They were working, by way of theorizing, the messy points of contact between the ends of language and the chaos of a desiring life experienced as the force of discipline and escape. To this end, both their organized disappearance in LGBT history and their reemergence as an activist ideal extinguished their disruptive legacy, the unruly ways they refused cold objection and calcified memorialization. Sylvia and Marcia, along with so many others, ought to be brought into the collective archive. But if their appearance does not destabilize the mode of their arrival, then we have failed to do more than accommodate difference. The neoliberalization of identity as modernity's sedimentation. So that's just a little bit to give you some of the kind of context of the book and the way that I'm thinking about the contemporary moment and what's happening with Marcia and Sylvia.
I'm feeling all the like what fucking pride feels, Eric. You know, when you're reading, I'm thinking about Marcia and Sylvia, and I'm thinking about trans women of color that are like closer to me in time and space and in life and death. And I'm thinking about like how we remember them at this time and throughout the year, and how the memorialization of them, it doesn't end during this season. And it also doesn't end with the other kind of marked times for grieving that we're allowed to kind of escape to as trans people. Maybe, yeah, that's enough for right now for us to kind of start with. I also want to know when I want to know if I can read it out loud, the parts. This becoming ungovernable. This is this part, as well as what you have to say about near life. I think that those are some of the most generative things about this book for me. I want to read the part of the coda, if that's okay, that I like a lot. Because it helps me. It's helped me to feel grounded since Friday. Against the relentless violence this book has attempted to describe, and the numerous attempts of a state that wills death as the promise of life, becoming liberated or getting ungovernable might offer a way out, or at least through harm's persistence. Here, I have argued that the state's spirit, even in its incisively democratic form, contra the pervasive screams of liberalism, is not in crisis, y'all, is not in crisis. Indeed, the endless ways of our contemporary moments of empire are able to find new and even more callous tactics to capture, imprison, and liquidate under the very name of democracy, coheres more than it interrupts. In contrast to believing these violations are evidence of its decline, Eric is suggesting something much more wicked, a wickedness that must be brought into relief if we are to comprehend, let alone confront it. To restate one of their arguments, racialized anti-trans and queer violence is not antagonistic to the democratic state. It is among its foundations. And so here I'm wondering, what are those other things that are foundational to the democratic state? And I know that the erosion of some kind of rights is a part of that, y'all. I know. To question democracy, even from the left, authorizes suspicious despair and raw hostility directed toward all that give it language. Yet those produced as democracy's debris from the global wars waged under its name, to the internal attacks ordered against anyone who dreams of more demand our resolve. This drama was particularly evident in the aftermath of the Donald Trump and subsequent attempts to denounce him and his administration as an outlier in the otherwise smooth space of the United States. This proclamation, "This is not normal," codifies the ringing truth of its own lie. Yet the architecture of this reclamation, its non-performance, enables the force of liberal normativity to pull the center further toward the right in hopes of recovering a now challenged fantasy of protection that was never there for most. So here I'm thinking about those post-Roe realities and how many of us have been always already navigating them because of the waiting periods and because of the restrictions that already existed before last Friday. I'm sorry, I'm finishing here. I'm finishing. Tragically, we are returned to the dreaded cage of realism, where less bad becomes the only name freedom can take. My intent here is not to erase the vicious specificity many of us are living and dying through in the current nightmare misnamed the United States, but what closures come with reading such habituation as rupture. Really, really appreciate you so much, Eric, but this has been, or those 2 paragraphs, I've been going back to them since Friday and encouraging, like, if other folks are not able to get through your entire book at this time, then perhaps they could read that coda and have a lot of fucking information about like where to go with these feelings, with this rage, and with this grief.
Wow, thank you, Ash, for sharing that. It's yeah, I haven't heard anybody else read it out loud, so it's really nice. I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to see, you know, how you're sitting with that. So the kind of, just to give some people some more background for the coda, you know, what I'm essentially arguing before that is exactly what Ash was referring to there, that you know, what do we do with the fact, and I'm going to call it a fact, right, that you know, racialized anti-trans and queer violence is indeed foundational to democracy, right? It's not the failure of democracy, it is its foundation, right? And so, you know, what do we do with the very question / proclamation of the democratic form itself, right? Because what I was noticing is that, you know, everyone loves democracy, but none of us really know what it means or what its like kind of interiority is, right? So you have, you know, anti-colonial freedom fighters demanding democracy, and you have George Bush demanding democracy, right? And you go back to the founding of the settler state, which we call, you know, this place, you know, and you have the framers thinking, oh, the state might become too democratic, so how can we put kind of guards on it? And then you have the left saying it's not democratic enough, right? But most of us are still so attached to the very concept that it doesn't allow us to dream of something else, right? What is this? To me, it feels like a weight that's pulling us to the bottom of the ocean. And again, that's not, to be clear, it's not because I'm longing for some kind of totalitarianism or some sort of like that, right? But I actually think that the collective we have so much, you know, amazing brilliance with and among us that we can come up with something else, right? Why is it that we're, you know, so attached to this raggedy ass constitution and those people, right? Like, that's never going to save us. It has never saved the majority of the people in the United States or indeed around the world. It actually is the shield that is used to defend empire, right? We're not going to find home there, right? And so while that can feel disempowering, what I hope it does, at least in the coda, is actually opens up a whole bunch of space, right? And when we let go of that weight, then we're able to do a lot of different things. And so that's what I'm very clear, I don't have a prescription for this. I don't have like a political program. I just have a bunch of questions that are gleaned from struggle that I've been involved in. You know, that's all I have to offer, nothing else. And so, you know, it ends again with a bunch of questions around like, what else could we do? What could we do together, right? And I think this, Ash, exactly how you're putting it, this moment when people are like, oh, we need to pack the court, we need, you know, we need the right justices, we need all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it's never, you know, it never has and never will, right? You know, we need to abolish the Supreme Court and all the courts after that. You know, and I think that then is the floor. That's the point of departure, not the point of arrival. And that's one of the things that abolitionist teaching has really forced me to reckon with, right? If we can imagine the end of prisons, then we have to imagine the end of the Supreme Court.
While I have you, Eric, so something that I've been thinking about since the last time we had an opportunity to talk and about the book, why a coda? Why is the last part a coda? One of the functions that the reading group had, you know, throughout our 5 weeks together is we are doing a lot of defining words that we don't know together and alone. And I one of the questions I asked during week 5 is like, have you all ever read a book with a coda in it? Or have you ever read theory like with a coda in it? And like, where do we see codas come up? And I personally was feeling like, oh, it's gay. It's this like really, or it's something that like gay people would know about and recognize in terms of this format. Can you say a little bit more about the end and why it's a coda?
I mean, I haven't thought about that, but now I'm going to use it. I'm going to cite you, Ash, the gay, yeah, the gay coda. I love it. It's so good. I mean, yeah, in a certain sense, right? It's something that doesn't necessarily belong. It's not part of the kind of imagined theoretical arc of the book. It's just usually I should say people oftentimes take that space to wild out a little bit more than they would in the other part. It's also what I wrote last. It wouldn't exactly make total sense as a chapter, but I think I'm actually the most clear in terms of what the book is about, right? For me, I worked on this book for 15 years. And so it took me a long time to figure out what it was about. And this was like the very last thing that I wrote. And it took me all that time in writing that to be like, oh, this is what this book is about, as a kind of, and it's queer in that sense, right? It's kind of like a backwards looking, retroactive way of understanding your own process, right? You oftentimes don't know what it is until you're deep in it. Yeah, and so that's why it ended up being a coda. It's also like much shorter, and so it's pretty short for people that haven't seen the book. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I feel like, I haven't yet, but I imagine also that will be the part that I get the most pushback on, because I think it's really like pushing people to, again, question democracy, which is the thing that is oftentimes, all of us, myself included, that are really good at coming for every kind of term and idea, somehow that like gets left there. And I'm like, what if we go back and pick it up and shake it off and flip it around and see what this thing actually is? And it's not that I'm not a historian of democracy or Greece or any of those things, but that democracy has always mandated the brutal subjugation of particularly enslaved people, enslaved African and Black people and women and a whole bunch of other people, and the kind of ongoingness of settler colonialism, at least in this context, right? Speaking to you from Palatine land, what does that mean? That it has always been necessarily a violently incomplete project, right? The we of the people, that is always constituted through negation, through exclusion. And that exclusion has always been racist, it has always been gendered, and it has always been bloody as hell.
I wanna kind of ask you about that. So it's bloody as hell, it's hard, it's rough. And then Eric, you also said something about a weight being pulled down into the middle of the ocean. Another one of the things that sat out to me as I continue to read the book and during the reading group certainly is your use of language, like a science-y language about the environment, to talk about some of these scenes of violence. One of the things that I recall you doing is using like some kind of, to me it reads as like obsession and care, both obsession and care as you write about something that these scenes that are so dark, and there was some relief I found and we found in reading together, your use of some of the imagery and the terms about the wind and the atmospheric nature of violence. Could you say anything about that? And I also am here, I want to know what writing like that did for you as you were having to, know these details, perhaps in an obsessive way about the nature of the death and the violence, but what it was like for you to write about that and give it to us. And I want to know if, being in nature, being outside, I want to know if that's also a part of like how you continue to, I guess, interact with people who are reading this book.
Wow, those are such excellent observations and questions. I think that, I'm always searching for language and metaphor as an attempt to get closer to something that might seem really self-evident, right? I think that the world is always endlessly more complicated than we have language to apprehend it, right? And so I'm always searching, I'm always grasping for new forms of language that can kind of like hopefully get us a little bit closer to the precision that I'm always hoping for, while knowing it that's going to fail also. So I think, yeah, some of my metaphors do come from like sciencey things. I think that probably has a lot to do from coming from like AIDS activism, actually, which is where I first started thinking about science. I never went to like science class in high school because I never went to high school. And so that's where I learned about biology and about chemistry and all those kinds of things. So I think that those in particular, ACT UP was so engaged in thinking about the necessity and the possibility of scientific metaphors for thinking about bodies and their place in the world. So I do see that a lot of that kind of genealogy in my own writing. And then the question of the weather, right? Atmospheres of violence actually comes from a quote from Fanon. But he's perhaps one of the kind of central thinkers, along with Marcia. I would say that they're like the two central thinkers that I keep returning to in the book. And there's something about the word atmospheric, for him, atmospheres of violence, that is both material and non-material, is both everywhere and nowhere, is both something that we're experiencing, but it's really hard to describe. It's something that you might not be able to actually give language to it until you're like in a different form of it, until you're in a different atmosphere. It engulfs us. It is everywhere. It can kill us. It can also, and is also the precondition of life. Right. And that's actually how I think about violence in the book. And I make it incredibly clear that for me, my political aim, or whatever it is to end these forms of violence, right? Which is to say, to end the world that mandates them. That being said, the question of violence is always left open as a question, right? Where does it end and where does it begin? Who is subject to its administration and who is not, right? We know, of course, that the state has the monopoly on violence, which means it gets to decide what constitutes violence and what isn't, right? So if we dislodge that, then it opens up this question of, for Fanon, what he called revolutionary violence. We might call it just self-defense. We might call it community collective self-defense, right? If we think of the self as a collective self, which I do. And so for me, all of that is there. And then in terms of the writing of the book, I think that that's one of the reasons it took so long, because I think throughout the entirety of it, I wasn't sure if I should be doing it. And that ambivalence is, a politically motivated ambivalence. It's not because I'm like, oh, I don't know if I should be doing this. It's actually like, what does it mean? How can I write with as much care and precision as I can, while also knowing that, it's incomplete and it's, failed and all those other things, right? So to hold open those questions instead of close them down, right? I could say like, I am authorized to do this because X, Y, and Z. I'm a survivor of this. I could do that, and it might give the reader a little bit more space. But I actually think that it's much more complicated than that. And that's, again, one of those second order displacements where I'm just hiding from it. And I think that, again, if we're going to think atmospherically about violence, it's anywhere and everywhere. Of course, it's radically differentially distributed, right? Which the whole book is about how different people experience it differently, right? How even different people that identifies all these different things, right? So it's not a book really about people or identities. It's about like lenses and ways to think about the world. And I think that that's another kind of something I try to make clear, but oftentimes gets lost, right? It's not a like LGBT history book. It's about thinking, attempting to think with all these other organizers and revolutionaries and activists and theorists and whatever, they're all those things at once. How modernity, produces its seeming consistency, right? How does it just keep going, right? How does what happened on Friday and what's happened before that and what's always happening, right? The state of emergency that is the world itself. Keep going, and here we are, right? And something that is actually important to me, and I hope comes up, and I think perhaps comes up more in the coda, is that what's so beautiful in all the horror and all the deadliness is the way that people get by and just do rad things and keep going. And right, this isn't like a story of uplift or of survival. It's not like that kind of narrative, but it's about something else, right? And that's where the ungovernability comes in. It's like, it's not about ascension. It's about like kind of going to the side or going underground or finding another way out, right? It's about escape hatches and cons and all those kinds of things, right? And that's, if there ever were a queer mode of survival, that would be it, right? We all know that, right? We all know about quote unquote forged documents. We all know about, borrowing someone else's insurance. We all know about those things. And for me, that form of ungovernability leads to a different set of questions than the kind of democratic respectability which we seem to be caught in.
Absolutely, Eric. What you've said is, it's making me think about how this book, but also I believe Captive Genders, it enables someone like me to be able to talk about anti-trans violence and abortion access at the same damn time. In one way to say like, okay, so sure, if they're coming for me, they're coming for you, but also the key to controlling entire communities is through the control of bodies. And so if we understand these forms of violence, if we consider what you're saying about like how it impacts us like materially and immaterially, and how it's of us and in us and around us. Yeah, I'm just thinking about how like the book makes it more possible for me to bring those two things in together, and then kind of circling back to ungovernability as I think for some of us it's the only option that we have. Like we don't actually get to choose whether or not we're going to follow the law. Like we're being pushed. We don't get to choose if we're going to like do it the right way. We have to find a way out, find the escape hatch, find the trap door. And so I really appreciate what you've shared. I want to know, Eric, about, okay, so Pride season, it's Pride, whatever. I want to know also what pride. I want to know something that has gagged you. I would love to know something that you've seen that's gagged you this Pride season. Would you share it with us? What have you been gagged by? Like you just could not take it.
Oh no. Got about 16 hours. So yeah, I'm going to answer that question. Then I want you to answer that question. Then I would love to hear you talk more about how you're doing that work, because I'm actually, in reality, I'm having a lot of trouble linking. I mean, in my activist circles, it's fine linking up the reproductive justice, access to abortion, and trans liberation. It's all right there for all of us, but then you step a little bit outside, or you move a little bit outside, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, the same people that are trying to take away trans access to gender affirming care are actually like screaming at the abortion march for pro-abortion. There's that whole thing that I think we collectively, and I know that you're like on the forefront of thinking about that, and so I'd love to hear more about that. But the question of Pride. Okay, so San Francisco Pride, which is it the most horrible? I mean, it's not fair to just name one, but it is, usually ideally I leave town for that time because it's totally insufferable, right? The straight Pride March. And so, but for the last 50 years, people in San Francisco have been organizing to get the police out of the parade. 2 years ago, there's a little bit of an opening because of the globalized revolts that were happening. And so Pride official, right? They wouldn't agree to actual demands, right? The organizers were demanding that the cops out of Pride and the corporations out of Pride. But instead of that, they were like, okay, how about just cops not in uniform? Because if cops are in uniform, they get paid for marching. So they're like, okay, no cops in uniform. And so this was the real test case, because the last 2 years it hasn't happened, right? So this was the real test case because the Pride was in person this year. And of course, the police union and the fire union, right? So we need to think about fire people as well, joined together and said that if they can't march in uniform, they won't march, right? Because they won't get paid. And then, of course, the Mayor London Breed, the straight mayor, joined in the protest of Pride, saying she won't march, and a bunch of other kind of, middle of the road conservative politicians. And so what happened? So we were like, okay, victory. We've got all these people. That's great. The police won't march. That actually kind of worked a little bit. But of course, there was a backroom deal when Pride then made a bunch of concessions that none of the organizers were involved in, and they allowed the police to march in their uniforms with their guns, and the community, which means all the nonprofits, celebrated as a victory, right? So they're like, oh, we're all in this again together. It was one of those moments, and I have these moments every 5 years, where your theoretical politics becomes so material that you can't even put it into words. It actually sounds like a ridiculous, conspiracy when you're like, they meant it, it's like, literally, that's the news story. So that made me feel pretty gagged, because I feel like, where do we go from here in a kind of movement space when, and I should say that the reason that London Breed, the mayor, refused to march, because she said that not allowing LGBT cops to march was a form of anti-trans and queer discrimination, right? So then inclusion of the officers becomes the moment of alleged progress, right? And so it's this really upside down world where including those that have historically been abused and contemporary, right, that's still happening, then becomes the moment, right? And so it's like the way that neoliberalism has so deeply entrenched itself in the language that we have historically used to think about the world, then where do we go, right? How do we get ahead, beside, underneath? Where do we go with that project, right? Because that language, that's not working anymore, because they control that, right? She did the same thing when they were trying to reduce the police officer, the SFPD class for next year, because she was saying that most of the new officers would be Black and brown, and so then it will be anti-Black violence to decrease the police budget, right? And the police budget for San Francisco, it's a pretty small city, is $1 billion, supposed to be. So then defunding the police becomes anti-Blackness, and excluding gay cops from Pride then becomes a form of anti-trans and queer violence, right? This upside down world that I'm really fascinated with, but I'm totally I don't know what to do with. So I'd love to hear what got you.
Two things gagged me. So I saw a little commercial for Postmates bottom friendly menu. Talk about okay, so we can't use that anymore. We can't, they got they're on to us now. They're on to us. I was really gagged by that, this bottom friendly menu on Postmates. I just really couldn't take that. And then another thing that gagged me was, I think it wasn't San Francisco, but another Pride, they said no to cops, and they had them sectioned off. They had them kind of sectioned, and the gay cops were like, let us in, chanting, let us in. I was, very gagged by that as well. And I couldn't really take it. And then you wanted to know about kind of how I'm trying to think about these things, theoretically, how I'm trying to bring them together when I'm not talking to the friends and stuff, our friends. And something that I have to go back to, Eric, is cis heteronormativity. It dictates us so much for abortion access and reproductive justice in ways that no one's talking about except for me and the other trans people that are barely there and barely included. But in the way that people who are or they think they care about the ways in which trans and queer people experience violence, I feel like talking about cis heteronormativity and what it dictates, it's easy to talk about it there. And then when I think about RJ and abortion, I think about the times that I was told, you're ridiculous for talking about Roe is going away. And you're also ridiculous and bad for saying so fucking what. And I'm also reminded of the times that, like, you know, organizing locally with trans and queer folks in Charlotte, it would be like, you all change your genders so much that we shouldn't listen to you because you don't know what you are. So how can we listen to you about defunding the police if your pronouns are always changing and if your name is always changing? And so I'm really thinking about yeah, like making it really clear. And for me, I feel the need to like go back to how cis heteronormativity dictates so much. And the body, I think I go back to the body, and I also struggle because I want people to know, like, reproductive justice is not just about the body, and like why I don't need to be saying that, because like when we're talking about health insurance and violence in the streets and police, like that is at the side of the body, or all of those things are registering at the side of the body. In access to abortion care, that is body, that's body. Incarceration, like folks are experiencing that at the side of their body. I also want to say here, Eric, my friends inside, so Kanata Kazeri Brown and Ashley Insko, those are two trans women who are inside prisons in North Carolina that I talk with regularly. And they actually are making it very clear for me, or helping me to like point to examples like, yo, like we actually have to look at this, especially as there's this, I call it like incorrections, the reason that corrections doesn't have to abide by like the American Medical Association and shit is because like they have their own corrections, like the logics of like incarceration. They have their own medical things like that say that shackling a pregnant incarcerated person is okay, that say that someone can go long without care for urology. It's, you know, that say that like folks yeah, they don't need access to testosterone. So my friends are making it clear for me as I'm like advocating alongside them, like, wow, these things are so connected. Sometimes I think it's a matter of like getting the right person to listen. And at the end of the day, I think like being able to talk about like, being able to talk about how we have thought about these things in a binary or mutually exclusive for too long. And the part of why the book that you wrote is so valuable is because it's offering us a way to kind of think about these things in this antagonistic way and not in this binary way. Yeah, like there was a part in the reading group where we were thinking about like antagonism, the relationship to antagonism and binary, and yeah, it was just really helpful. I'm gonna pause there.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm excited to hear about the reading group. Yeah, as we all know, we write these things and they just disappear into the world, and you're like, so everything you say is so incredibly, you know, not just useful, but like vitally necessary and the only way that we're going to survive. Like, I just want to, you know, underscore that 5,000 times, because what you're saying about those forms of solidarity and the deep solidarity that is messy and sometimes fight a lot, and you know, you're on the wrong side, you're on the right side, whatever it is, right? But like staying in it and figuring it out together, again, is the escape hatch, I think. You know, those deep forms of solidarity. And you know, I will say I am seeing a lot more of it now, right? People making those kinds of connections than I ever have in my life. At the same time, we're experiencing the pushback in ways that feel really unique to this historic moment, right? So it's both those things, right? It's like kind of turf avalanche and, you know, literal, you know, all out war on reproductive justice, and that a very expansive understanding of that, at the same time that we're building these forms, you know, of solidarity that I think were pretty unthinkable even 5 years ago. So it's both those things, right? That's the kind of question of antagonism, for me at least. You know, and antagonism is useful because, for me at least, because of one of the things that I'm always attempting to do, or the thing that I think writing or theory, whatever it is, can maybe do is sharpen the contradictions, right? It's like an old Marxist term, to the point where ideology then speaks, right? Ideology makes itself known. I think that that's one of the things, perhaps the only thing that it can really do. And so that's what I'm attempting to keep doing, to keep like press. That's, with, for example, the concept of democracy. And I see Scott has a question. And if other people have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A thing and we'll try to talk about them. So with the concept of ungovernability. So in that coda, when I start writing about it, actually, I pull it, that specific term from juvenile jails and juvenile quote unquote justice system, right? Juvenile punishment systems, that it's a kind of extra legal designation that you can use either against your own wards or your own children, or a judge can then label your children that then relinquishes you or a guardian of any kind of legal responsibility to them. And so, what people have talked about is that oftentimes trans and queer people, their parents or guardians will get them labeled that because they want them put in juvenile jail, right? And that's a hard reality, right? Oftentimes we think about the story of the parents that are trying to keep their kids out of jail, and that's definitely happens a lot. But there's another story to be told there, right? And that's a specifically trans and queer story about parents that don't want themselves to be put in jail or have fines levied against them because of their children's truancy, because the children are being attacked at school, right? So that's a different kind of story. And so those young people oftentimes get labeled ungovernable, right? Their unwillingness to be governed by a parent or a guardian and or society writ large, right? And so it's a negative designation, and it comes with material impacts, right? It can lead them to prisons or jails, juvenile jails or then prisons. So that's very real. But at the same time, right, there's something like so generative and indeed so like beautiful about the forms of solidarity that they're building with each other, where they're like, you know what? I'm not going to go to school and get beat up. I'm just not going to do it, right? I'm going to figure out something else. I'm going to figure out another way to build my life. And again, that's thinking about kind of queer tactics or queer genealogies of struggle. That's one of the foundational ones, right? That removing oneself from whatever form of, familial institutions and building other ones, right? Building possibly horizontal institutions of kinship or something like that. So then ungovernability has, both of those tied up in them, right? So it's not a kind of pure, revolutionary radical. Its revolutionary radical potentiality is not unmarred by the very conditions of the world, right? So it's complicated. And nonetheless, I think there's like some wiggle room or something in there, just something that shines to me, that pulls me towards it. And I think it also primarily works through negation, but that negation is collective, right? So it's saying like no to this, but those no's together actually build something else. It's not just a no to everything. To me, it's not a form of nihilism, but it's a form of collective negation that at least looks towards or envisions or something. I don't know what the metaphor is, again, some sort of world after this world, because that's where we're going to have to get to if any of us are going to survive. So for me, it does all those things, and it's not a like prescriptive politic, it's not like something we can do, but it is a word that perhaps can, lead us somewhere different.
Thank you. Should we look at the questions from our folks?
I guess you all can't. I don't know if y'all can see these questions, but this really amazing question was about the place that specifically trans women of color, maybe trans femmes writ large, but trans women of color and trans women now kind of function, right? And that's what I was talking about in the little part that I read. I mean, I go on to think about it a little bit more, but this way where trans women of color are brought in as evidence. What is the other term, right? As evidence or as a kind of allegory for the argument that you're actually trying to make without attempting to think with. Here, for example, Marcia as a theorist, she is like, again, probably the primary theorist that I think with, right? She's not I try to work hard to not make anybody an example, but indeed to think with people as theorizing, as producing knowledge, as, you know, actors in the world, right? And there is this way in all kinds of people do this now. It's a really common function, right? To, again, create specifically Marcia and Sylvia, but a lot of other people as the activist ideal, right? The kind of purely radical, you know, figure outside of history that can't have no messiness, that can't have no interiority, that just like exists as the poster or the shirt, the poster at the nonprofit or the shirt at Target. Or I saw Marcia P. Johnson beer a couple of years ago. That was really a lot. Yeah, and so I think that bringing that to the fore is necessary, right? That's why it's in the introduction, because that is the long genealogy of queer theory or even LGBT history, you know, and I think that, again, it's that question of what does it mean to, you know, bring people or bring histories into a collective archive if the collective archive itself is not essentially destroyed, right? Because that archive is built through racial capitalism, through settler colonialism, through all forms of exclusion, right? That's the literal mechanism of the archive, of archiving. And so we can't do it that way. We have to think of other ways of doing it. And hopefully the book like does a little bit of that. Again, it's not, you can't do everything. But yeah, that's how I think about it. But that's a really excellent question. I don't know if you have anything else, Ash, you want to add to that? No.
I don't, but thank you. I like this question, Eric, about why did you choose to think with Fanon as opposed to other revolutionaries? I imagine it's because of the way that he used violence, but would love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, that's another amazing question. So, Fanon. I don't actually have a, how should I say this? I mean, Fanon has been one of those people, right? He died very early. He wrote not a ton, and I mean, he wrote a lot for the short amount of time he was on Earth, but the kind of depth of his writing, the political conviction, the clarity, but also his willingness to mix genres, to think with and against Marxism, to think with and against psychoanalysis, right? He's a practicing analyst, you know, essentially a psychologist working in the battlefields, you know, attending to French soldiers in the daytime and the FLN, the anti-colonial Algerian freedom fighters at night, right? And so his practice is informed by that. And then his theoretical, which is also to say his materialist writing, is informed by that practice, right? So it's this kind of loop that for me, you know, he gets at so much depth. One of his sentences can kind of rip the world apart in a really mesmerizing way for me. And I think that's because of the pressure under which the time he was writing, right? He's literally like writing, or he's dictating it actually, you know, on the battlefield. And then a lot of his last writing, he was dying of leukemia actually in Bethesda, Maryland. You know, and so it's like he's writing under all these spaces of intense force and revolutionary possibility, right? This is also the time of decolonization and of armed struggle. And so for me, He's one of those people that helps, again, thinking about this kind of atmospheric or this seeming totality of violence, while also believing that there's some way out of it, right? For him, it was armed struggle, right? It was the necessity of armed struggle for him. And so for me, that's why, at least in this book, it felt really important to go back to that kind of schema, right? And, Fanon, like all of us, is a complicated figure. There's many people, Fanonian scholars, that, think about his perhaps deep misogyny and trans and or homophobia, right? So that's all there too, because he's a person of his time. But there's also a way to read against and with that, right? It doesn't mean we don't work with Fanon's amazing writing. We think about its complexity and other ways to read it, I think. So that's why Fanon, at least there in this book, is so important. I mean, he's one of the people, whenever I open up Black Skin, White Mask, and I teach it kind of a lot, I'm just like, oh my God, this sentence. You can endlessly go back to him and think with him. Yeah, has that happened? Or Ash, has that happened to you? The question, sorry, I can't read these probably, or I don't know if you can. The question of like, have you put out something and then it's been appropriated or reused kind of against the way you were meeting it, or
I'm thinking about my master's thesis. It's out there. A lot of things have changed for me. A lot of the ways that I'm thinking about philosophy and dance and performance as it relates to corporeality and how Black queer people use our bodies to do direct action in the movement for Black lives. All of that is really different now. I wonder though about how it might be like used against me in the future, and I wonder like who might want to talk to me about like how or what I was writing about back then. I also want to say here, like, captive genders, for me, that was like how I got to know Eric Stanley, or know about Eric. And so it has been a book that I have returned to time and time again. And I feel there's some ways that I felt like, okay, Eric's going to be giving captive genders and atmospheres of violence. Like, I think that was one of the first things in the reading group that I wanted to talk about. Like, what do y'all think it's going to be like? It's going to be giving captive, but it wasn't. And I was very excited about that too. Very excited.
Yeah, that's also, I mean, the question of appropriation, or just the way, I mean, anything you put out in the world can just go any which direction. You're just like, I don't even know. And it's hard. Like, I'm fine when people disagree with me when it's like the thing, but sometimes things will get flipped upside down. I'm like, that is not what I was saying at all. But that's just the what happens when you put things out in the world and you can't really control it. It can be frustrating, or it can be whatever, but whatever. And so then there's another really excellent question about the kind of connections or the resonances between perhaps atmospheres of violence and Saidiya Hartman's work, specifically, sorry, it just moved up, Wayward Lives, which if you have not read it yet, please do. It's an amazing book. And Black feminist theory, theories specifically of ungendering, which comes from Horton Spillers. I mean, I think that for me, the book, it's interesting because the people, the kind of theoretical schools that it would probably find the most affinity with are, Black feminism, Black critical theory, and really not so much queer studies. If you look at who I'm actually engaging with, and I think that's, I make those specific choices because of the way that I was trained and the things that I'm drawn towards and things that I'm like less drawn toward. I don't like have it. It's not like a beef with what usually gets counted as queer theory, but it's just like the things that help me understand the world and what I'm trying to think with oftentimes come from specifically, it's always important to name it right, like kind of radical Black feminism, which so people like Saidiya Hartman's work and thinking about, right in that book, she's trying to write I mean, among other things, she's, thinking about and writing a kind of deeply researched, speculative history of lived life, but also kind of unlived life. And so how do you do that? Right. And so that's a really important way, and an incredibly, right, the subtext of the book, it's an incredibly queer way to think about the very question of history. Yeah, so I definitely so maybe, yeah, just so there's one other question. If people have other questions, we'll probably, I'm guessing, wrap up kind of soonish here. But there's a question about the question of the human, right, as a kind of category that I work with a lot in the book, or work against a lot in the book, and its relationship to democracy, right? Democracy, right, we can go back to Athens, we can go to de Tocqueville, right, all these kind of quote unquote great thinkers of democracy. I'm obviously using that in scare quotes, to think about, right, one of the arguments that I make that, again, is deeply entwined with Black feminist theory, is that people like Sylvia Winter, right, the figure of the human is the precondition for the very possibility of being a rights-bearing subject, which is to say being a subject of democracy, right? That's one of the arguments that Saidiya Hartman also makes in Scenes of Objection, right? It's a kind of fundamental argument around the place of the human as a category, as a kind of theological, mythological, but also material precondition of being a subject in the world, right? And so if you have forms of life that reside outside of that, beside that, underneath that, again, whatever preposition, then how do we account for that? And so then that figure becomes a useful kind of contra to the what I call near life or something like that. And so yeah, it becomes useful because it shows how democracy, the we of democracy, the we of the people, is always a fiction. Yeah, so there's maybe this will be the last one, but there's a really great, sorry, it's like flips around. I'm like, what's going on? Still not that great with Zoom. So there's a question about visibility, about being clocked, about anti-trans violence, the question of visibility, and this kind of goes back to things that Joanna and Tourmaline were thinking about in Trapdoor, and then all the authors as well, but like the kind of point of departure for that book, and then people took it away. Same with Captive Genders, right? Like, I'm just like the party planner. The brilliance of that book is the brilliance of the people in the book, which is not me. And so, right, the question of visibility is so important because as I try to think about it, vis-a-vis Marcia's theorization through an interview that she did with the Village Voice, is it's, both the thing that brings us into the world and also that which can bring us out of the world, right? So what that means is that visibility, and right, this is a kind of common argument now that, right, you have to see a version of yourself to kind of come into selfhood, right? So you have to see something akin to you or some image of yourself in whatever visual culture, right? So that's the kind of basic structure of identification. But that being said, at the same time, for non-subjects or people that are produced as non-subjects in the world, it's also then the way that you're taken out of the world vis-a-vis the direct attacks on, for example, trans people, right? So it's that kind of doubling that is really important for us to collectively understand, right? And lots of people have done this work, but I think it's, again, bringing it up because liberalism, the kind of liberal politics that we're now living under argues that, visibility isn't necessarily good, and that, visibility leads to progress, and progress is a real thing, and progress leads to freedom, right? That's the kind of arc of rainbow of progress that we're all living and dying under. And yet we all experience the world as not that, And so, how are those things playing off of each other? And how is that rainbow arc of progress actually hiding the everydayness and the ongoingness of violence, right? It's that kind of structure that I think is really important. Yeah, so, but yeah, thank you so much for that question. Okay, maybe this will be the last one. And Ash, do you have anything else that you wanted to say about the question of visibility? Because I know it's something that you think a lot about.
I don't.
Okay, just, okay, so the last one, I'll maybe put these two together. Your thoughts about the pop theoretical idea of the gaze trope in film, specifically your thoughts on Candy's death and Pose or Venus extravaganza. Okay, I mean, yes. I've never really seen Pose, so there's that. But there is a way in which trans life, particularly trans women, black and brown, indigenous trans women, and trans women of color get produced as the kind of tragic object of media, right? And that was also something important for me to kind of, it's not you really push against or push back. It's just, again, because all that violence is real, right? Venus extravaganza is murdered. But nonetheless, there's, all these other ways that people are producing life and producing worlds that don't negate that, right? They don't stop that violence, but they build out the possibility that collective survival might happen, right? So when I think about, this really great, and the coda, I think about this film that Tourmaline made with Miss Major, called The Personal Things. You can find it online. It's very easy to find online. And one of the stories that Major tells in that is how she switched all of her IDs. She narrates it, from all of her IDs from M to F. She was living like that, and then she switched them all back because she wanted to explicitly be known and be read as a transgender woman, and she says, fuck everybody else, right? And that's a kind of anti-progress narrative that goes against the narrative structure that we're told about trans life and the possibility of trans life that starts at this one place and ends somewhere else, where we know the messiness of life, again, is always exceeding language, right? And she's not making a prescription. She's not saying this is the right way to be trans. She's not doing any of that. She's just saying this was her way to strike back. That's the term that she uses. And this was kind of her form of antagonism, right? How to antagonize the world so that it, again, might crumble down so that so that the demand is not that you live in antagonism, right? Because that's the actual goal. Yeah, so I think that for me, there is that long and ongoing legacy of exploitation, of films like Paris is Burning, all that kind of stuff. But then there's all this other stuff that falls out of that narrative, and I'm really interested in that other stuff. While also thinking about, and this is important, kind of taking it back to where Ash began with thinking about how do we not let go of our connections to our family and friends and loved ones that are incarcerated and don't have access to this conversation, right? And so that's why books are important to me, and that's why, like, after all the books that I've done, all the profits just go to get people inside books for free. And I'm working with a number of reading groups in prisons and one in jail right now, and not surprising to any of us, right? The theorization that's coming from those reading groups of this book is blowing me away, and hopefully we're going to publish it in the next couple of months. But again, to the question of like where does knowledge belong? Where does it come from, right? Of course, it's no surprise that among the most radical theoreticians of revolution are indeed incarcerated right now. And I just want to like kind of bring us back there to remember that, because they don't have access to this. I'm going to send some of the highlights, transcribe it. But yeah, so thank you all. Ash, did you have anything you wanted to end with?
No, but thank you so much, Eric. Thank you.
Right, y'all. Yeah, it looks like we don't have any more questions. But thank you, Eric, and thank you, Ash. Thank you both so much for being here. You've given us so much to chew on, so much to think about, and I really appreciate you both so much. Yeah. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Firestorm.
Yes, thanks, Firestorm. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ash.
Thanks, Eric. Have a good one, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.